whatever reporting occurs on the actual electoral contest at Manguang, we are going to have some very misleading and very factually suspect reporting on the actual policy resolutions. And I think the reason for that is that people in the main don't understand the context in which these policy resolutions are being debated. The other problem, which I really think people need to rectify to a certain extent, which will cause some people to get the policy resolutions wrong, is that we don't seem to have a culture in much of our journalism at the moment of making sure that people are familiar with the recent history of organizations and the recent history of policy documents, because very often I'm now getting thoroughly used to people announcing new policy shifts when actually what people are doing is repeating decisions which were taken 5 years ago. But I think the context is the most important thing, and if you'll give me a couple of minutes to perhaps sound a bit boring and historical, but you can't understand what's happening today unless you understand what's been happening over the last 5 years. So let me say something which has been happening, about what has been happening over the last 5 years, and which I think is going to mislead quite a few people when we get to Manguang. And to explain what I'm getting at, I need to go back to March 2007. Because what happened in March 2007 is that the General Secretary of COSATU, Zwelinzima Vavi, gave an interview to a newspaper. And what he said was this. He said, the problem, COSATU wants to move the ANC to the left. The ANC is too conservative. It's not concerned about poverty and inequality. The ANC must move to the left. And the way in which COSATU is going to move the ANC to the left, Vavi said, was by flooding the ANC with worker delegates and poor people, etc. So in other words, a lot of workers were going to join the ANC, and that was going to shift the process. And as a result of that process, Vavi said, they wanted to solve what they considered to be the major problem in the ANC at that time. And the major problem they felt was that the leadership of the ANC, the National Executive Committee, and people in leadership positions consisted almost exclusively of middle-class people, business people, and professionals, and who quite obviously are interested in the interests of wealthier people, and they weren't interested in the welfare of workers and the poor. And therefore the strategy, the Polokwane strategy, according to Vavi, was, as I say, to flood the organization with workers so that they could elect people who were sympathetic to workers and the poor. What happened then was that about 6 weeks before Polokwane, COSATU held a conference to decide who to endorse, and proceeded to endorse a slate of candidates which included not a single person who could be considered poor, and only one person who could be considered a worker, I suppose, which was Gwede Mantashe, because he had been Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers. And the obvious question is why? And the very simple answer is that if you looked at the audited membership figures which were presented to Polokwane, you will see that what happened in the ANC during 2007 is that membership grew in areas where COSATU was weak, and it did not grow in areas where COSATU was strong. So in other words, in a nutshell, the strategy of flooding the organization with working people and COSATU members and people connected to COSATU was a failure. It didn't happen. And because it was a failure, COSATU realized 6 weeks beforehand that they would not be able to elect the slate of working and poor people which they'd hoped to elect. And as a result of that, they went with the best they could get in the circumstances, which was the leadership which has been in office over the last 5 years. Now, why am I telling you this? For two reasons. The first reason is that one of the realities about the African National Congress, which I think is still misunderstood, is that because of the events that occurred then, and nothing has fundamentally changed since then, the idea that the ANC is involved, is torn apart by a major battle between the left and the right, between people who are concerned about poverty and people who are concerned about the interests of middle-class people, is a misunderstanding of the reality. The ANC, particularly in leadership positions, remains precisely what Zwelin Zimbabwe said it was in March 2007, which is an organization composed mainly, certainly at the top echelons. I mean, poor people vote for the ANC in very large numbers, and working people vote for the ANC in very large numbers, but the leadership are not poor people. And if you don't, if you question this, all you have to do, which others have done, is get hold of, for example, a list of the 83 members of the National Executive Committee and have a look at their entries in Who's Who. And what you will see is a great many directorships. You will also know that when these checks are made, most of the people on the NEC have considerable assets in various large companies in this country, etc. So that is the reality. The reality is that although the base of the ANC is working and poor people, that's who goes out in droves to vote for the ANC, the people who are gathered at Polokwane are going to be largely middle-class people. And incidentally, that was one of the mistakes which was made in a lot of the coverage in Polokwane, because people saw, there was one group, you may have recalled, those of you who recall Polokwane, you may have recalled all the reporting about there was one group arriving in BMWs and there was another group arriving in buses, and the people arriving in buses were the poor and the neglected, etc. Well, actually, the people arriving in buses were the sort of next level of the middle class down. Okay, the poor were at home. Okay, the poor were not there because, for a variety of reasons in this country, and this is the reason, incidentally, that we've had 8 years of protests in the streets of our townships and tract settlements, is that poor people in this country are not part of the process. Okay, so that is the one reality within the ANC. And because that is the reality within the ANC, very often the policy debate tends to get distorted. Because people are, in a sense, very often maneuvering for the interests of middle-class groups. And although they're maneuvering for the interests of middle-class groups, everybody is well aware of the socio-economic profile of this country, and they know that middle-class people are not the majority or anything close to the majority. And you do not get very far in politics by saying, hi, I represent the upper middle class. So you have to present what you are doing as a pro-poor policy, and that is one cause of confusion in the policy environment. And I'll give you a specific example of this, which continues to bedevil the debate and continues to cause all sorts of confusion. Okay? And this is the great nationalization debate, which is going to be a considerable cause of confusion at Manguang. Now, let me state categorically, and I'm not just doing this to try to be controversial, I will demonstrate it, there is no nationalization debate, and there never has been a nationalization debate. Why do I say that? Because the leaders of the nationalization debate has centered around the documents produced by the African National Congress Youth League. Now, if you go and read those documents, or you go and read the document which is the nationalization document, it is not calling for nationalization. Okay? It is calling for two things which are not nationalization, and it's calling for them for a particular reason. The first thing it's calling for is for a much larger publicly owned mining company. At the moment, we have a publicly owned mining company in this country. In their document, they say it should own 60% of the industry. Well, anybody who's ever been to a bargaining session knows that you start off a bargaining session by asking for more than you think you're going to get. So let's say that they're asking for 60% because they want about 40%. That's usually the way bargaining works. What purpose would expanding the state mining company have? The purpose would be that if you are, and there are people like in this position in our country, if you happen, because of a whole lot of historical circumstances which have to do with our history, which we could go into, if you happen to be sitting at the moment on mining assets which are not doing very well because, to put it very bluntly, the white mining companies, when they did BEE, decided that the black owners should get the lousy shafts so that they could keep the good shafts. If you're sitting on the lousy shafts and you can sell them back to the taxpayer, then you can recover your assets and you can come out okay financially. That's the first half of the proposal. The second half of the proposal is that the state mining company should hand out mining licenses to private companies in order to mine. Now, as soon as you hand out licenses to private companies in order to mine, you are no longer talking about nationalization. Nationalization means public or state ownership. There's no private ownership in nationalization. And the obvious question is, why are some people very concerned to ensure that the company hands out the licenses? Well, the answer is very simple. If you happen to be in a controlling position in that company, if you happen to be in a senior position in that company, and this proposal would be to be accepted, you would be in a very good position to explain to the major mining companies that if they want a license, they really need to give 10% or 15% of their business to people, who really represent the people of South Africa, rather than the puppets and the stooges they're giving it to the moment. And it may simply turn out by some sort of coincidence that the people who you have in mind as the really authentic beneficiaries happen to be people who are connected to you in various ways. So in other words, what this is, what we've been debating for 2 years as a nationalization proposal, is actually an attempt by one group of connected people to get hold of assets at the expense of another group of connected people. And there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on. So that's the first point I want to make about the run-up to Manguang. That very often what you are dealing with is controversies and contests between middle-class people about how things should be divided, and you are not dealing with a debate about what ought to happen about poverty and inequality. The second point I want to make about Polokwane is that the most important thing which happened as a result of Polokwane, and which we've been, and you as journalists have been dealing with for the last 5 years, and it's not something I have to belabor very, very much, because it's part of every headline we read and virtually every news report we read, is that in a sense what Polokwane did was to take the lid off a pressure cooker. I don't know if anybody's familiar. I mean, I'm old enough to remember pressure cookers, which are these things you put up, lid down, and there's all this heat, and then when you put the lid out, all the stuff comes out, etc. And one of the things that came out in 2007 when the lid came off the ANC pressure cooker was a whole lot of contest and competition and conflict about who should be running things which had been there for a while and wasn't there in public. Now, to give you an idea of what this has meant for the African National Congress, you are talking about an organization which went in months, not in a couple of years, in months, from an organization which had not had a contested election for president in 58 years, to an organization in which absolutely everything was contested. You couldn't have a conference, whether it was one of the leagues or one of the provinces, etc., in which you didn't have factions and contests and competition, etc. And that has been the reality which has been going on for the last 5 years. Now, in principle, contest and competition can be very healthy for political organizations for all sorts of obvious reasons. You don't want leaders who are simply imposed from the top. You want leaders who have the support of the members, and because those leaders can hopefully also win the support of the voters. And there are obvious benefits to competition. On the other hand, competition only helps a political organization if two things happen as a result of that competition. And neither of those things are happening in the African National Congress. And when you hear what those two things are, you will hopefully find it very familiar, because no doubt some of you have been writing stories today about all this playing out in the political environment today, as it has been almost every day for the last 5 years. The first thing that has to happen is that the losers of any contest have to agree that the winners won fairly. The second thing that has to happen, if you're a political organization, is that the winners have to accept that the losers still have a role in the organization, even though they can't occupy the position. Now, neither of those things have been happening. The winners are never judged to have won fairly, because people say part of the result of this contest has been that all sorts of distortions have occurred, all sorts of malpractices have occurred, and if you want to know what those malpractices are and what those problems are, you don't need to listen to me droning on this afternoon. Just go onto the ANC website, read the discussion documents. They're all in the discussion documents. Nothing anybody has ever said, or nothing I am going to say, about the problems within the ANC caused by factionalism and people using money to buy votes and people using intimidation to buy votes. None of those cannot be found in ANC documents. They're all in the discussion documents. They have been repeated time and time again. And if you go on to the website this afternoon, onto the ANC website, and you have a look at the organizational renewal document, it's all in there. If you want to have a look at the document on leadership, it's all in there. And some years ago, it was all in the eye of the needle. So it's all out there. Everybody knows what's going on, but that doesn't mean that it's not a problem. Because although the ANC is probably, and I'm not, I'm not often nice about politicians and political organizations, but one of the remarkable things about the ANC, in my experience, compared to most countries I know, I've virtually never come across a political organization, and certainly a governing political organization, which is so frank about its own problems, which is so upfront about saying, look, this is wrong and that's wrong within the organization. So we all know what's happening, but unfortunately, the ANC's problem is that it's not all that, it's for a variety of reasons which are not necessarily the ANC's fault. It's a lot easier to actually talk about these problems than it is to solve these problems. Because these problems, yes, there are a lot that the ANC could do about them, but a lot of these problems have to do with very deep-rooted problems in our society, which I've talked about at some length and we can go back to. But let us simply say for now that as a result of various not only social inequalities we have in our society, but racial inequalities we have in our society, it's pretty inevitable that people are going to fight very hard to hang on to political positions, and that they're going to use all sorts of tactics in order to do that. And that is the reality which confronts the ANC at the moment. Within that, and that is very important to understand as we lead up to Polokwane, to Manguang, is that there's a lot of factionalism going on. Yes, there are cases in which principle matter, and there are cases in which ideology matters. There are people within the ANC who feel very strongly about various issues. And in a sense, when I said there's no nationalization proposal, that's not entirely true. There's no nationalization proposal which is being debated, but the National Union of Metal Workers, which is a COSATU affiliate, which is an ANC ally, the National Union of Metal Workers does in fact believe in nationalization, not ANC Youth League nationalization as we would understand in the textbook. But that is a very marginal view within the ANC. And the reason it's a marginal view in the ANC, get back to the point I made about Vavi's interview, because they have not succeeded in the last 5 years, for a variety of reasons, of changing that reality which he complained about in March 2007. The problem Vavi was talking about is still there. The ANC has not been flooded with working and poor people, and it remains an essentially middle-class organization. Within all that factionalism, and incidentally, let me say, and I hope this is not getting too detailed and digressing, etc., part of the factionalism is about ideology. Part of it is simply about who thinks who can deliver various goodies for them. And part of them is about the networks which have developed over the years within the ANC. The ANC was a struggle organization. The ANC fought apartheid. And when you fought apartheid, you worked with other people in networks. And very often those loyalties for older people have not gone away. The fact, just for as one example, the fact that President Jacob Zuma was head of ANC intelligence is immensely important, because intelligence people have a great deal of loyalty to him as a result of that. And those things appear in all sorts of strange places, so that very often, I'm always amused that, business people are very pleased that a sober gentleman in a pinstripe suit who always sounds like everybody's uncle is running the finance ministry, And he's very good at what he does, including sounding like everybody's uncle. And nobody is aware of why he's running the finance ministry. Why running the finance ministry? Because he used to work in Jacob Zuma's intelligence network. And that's considered important in terms of linkages, etc. But then within that, there are two major factions which are fighting for control of the ANC. And the interesting point about that is that neither Mr. Zuma nor Mr. Motlanthe are members of either of those factions. So when we hear about the Zuma faction and the Motlanthe faction, people are, I think, missing the point. The factions are very broad and very loose, but we can talk about them very generally as, on the one hand, and what we call the nationalist faction. Okay? And the nationalist faction is very concerned. The nationalisation proposal came out of the nationalisation faction. The nationalisation faction is very linked up to business people. It's often linked up to professional people. And it's very concerned about specifically racial inequality in business and the profession. It's very concerned about the idea that black people do not yet have a sufficient stake in business in this country and in the professions in this country. Now, as I indicated earlier, if that's what your concern is and you want to run the governing party and you want to run the country, you clearly cannot campaign simply on the idea that black people ought to control more of business and the professions, because the vast majority of people who want to vote for you are not in business and the professions and are going to say, well, that's nice, but what has it got to do with me? So you have to have a more general strategy. You have to talk very generally about nice slogans like economic freedom in our lifetime and transformation, etc. But essentially what you are concerned about is, as I say, not distribution to poor people. You are concerned about racial redistribution. And I'm always fascinated because occasionally I get to sit on public platforms with people who are in this faction. And I understand how the politics works, because very often it starts, we need massive change and we need, the poor must be recognized, etc. And then they forget all about the poor, and then we get down to business and we have a 45-minute discussion about who's got shares and about accountants and about lawyers and who needs to get hold of the poor. And that's really what it's about. So that's the one faction. And the other faction, I'm afraid, and this is where those of us in the business tend to let you down, etc., because we should be able to think of nice, fancy names which describe people. The other faction doesn't really have a name, except that it's the non-nationalist faction, because it is such a broad faction. It stretches from Kusatu and the SACP on the left to some very conservative people who are very traditionalists, etc. I mean, people like Patikile Holomisa would be in the non-nationalist faction. I don't think anybody would describe Patikile Holomisa as a radical. And they are concerned about two issues in the nationalist faction. First of all, they say, look, these guys are betraying non-racialism. The ANC has always stood for non-racialism, and these guys are not serious about non-racialism. Secondly, they say, look, these guys are subverting, in a sense, the ANC, because rightly or wrongly, and really I'm not taking sides between the factions, so I'm not interested in whether, I'm not saying it's right what, the allegations which are made, but the allegations which are made is that the nationalist group are the people who use money to buy favours, and they're the 10-entrepreneurs, and they're the guys who have the contacts who can make things happen so that they make sure that at any conference there are a lot of delegates there who they paid for, etc. So those are the divisions within the ANC. And what has been happening over the years is that both of those factions are not clear whether they have enough votes to win. They're not clear whether they have enough votes to control the ANC. And both of those factions have had a problem. And the problem is that you have a sitting president who's there, he's in office, and everybody knows the way in which political organizations work. The sitting president has quite a fair amount of influence about who gets what jobs in the cabinet and various other places. And you've got to be very careful about going up against a sitting president, because if you go up against a sitting president and you lose, well, quite clearly you're going to lose out on a whole lot of the posts that politicians find important. You're far more likely to land up as Deputy Secretary in Mpumalanga than you are as Minister of something or other. So the non-nationalists decided quite a while ago that they weren't going to challenge Mr. Zuma. Because they felt that he was the least worst option, and they could live with him, etc., even though he wasn't part of their faction. creating the very interesting situation in balance that if Mr. Zuma is re-elected, which incidentally I think he will be, for the second time running, he will be re-elected not because the majority of people at ANC conference wanted him, but because the majority of the ANC conference didn't want somebody else, which is an interesting wrinkle, but be that as it may. The nationalists went a little bit further and came up with a plan B. And the plan B was this. Their candidates couldn't get elected. And the reason I'm saying candidates is that one problem the nationalist faction has, and that's been playing itself out recently, is that it has two people in senior positions who both feel that they ought to be president. And it's not quite clear who the faction, and those people are, of course, Mr. Sequale, the Human Settlements Minister, and the Treasurer General, Mr. Pauza. So there is, I think basically the sort of default position is that Sequale is more likely, if the nationalist candidate could choose a president, Sequale is more likely to get it than Pauza, but it's not cut and dried. It's not 100%. The problem, of course, that they have is that he doesn't have the votes to get elected, and they knew that for a while. It was confirmed at Gallagher Estate at the policy conference when it was quite clear that he didn't have widespread support among the delegates. So there's a plan B, and the plan B is that you have a deputy president who is also not part of the factions. But if you can persuade the deputy president to run, then you can put your presidential candidate in as number 2, as the deputy president. You can put your rising star, who's the sports minister, Fagile Mbalula, in as secretary general. And you've already got the treasurer general. So if plan B works and Kgalema Motlanthe wins, then you've got 3 of the top 6, at least 3. You might have a 4th, Tandi Modise might get re-elected. And then you've got 4 out of 6 going into to the 2017 conference. That has been the plan B, and that has been what the politics have been about for the last year, etc. So as far as the election is concerned, one thing we know for certain is that the ANC is going to come out of Manguang with a president who is not in either of the factions. And that means that the factional issues are going to be around for the next 5 years, whoever wins at Manguang. In brackets, once again, maybe we're going to get a shock in the next while or so. I can't see how Kgalema Motlanthe wins at Manguang. I can't even see how Kgalema Motlanthe stands as a candidate for president in Manguang, because I gather you've had a session on the way in which the branches work and the way in which the nomination process works, and one way which the nomination process works is that you should know, and Kgalema Motlanthe has been around in the ANC long enough to know how this works, you should know where the branches are going before you get to Manguang, and it's not quite clear to me why you would want to run for president if the majority of branches are going to vote for the other candidate. But anyway, let's say we're wrong, that somehow there's some tsunami and somehow 50% of the branches suddenly emerge to support Kgalema Motlanthe and he becomes the candidate. The reality is still then that whoever is in charge of the African National Congress is not a member of either of the two factions, and the situation that we've been living with continues. Now, let me try and pull all these realities together and tell you what I think it means for policy at Manguang. If we are in a situation where fundamentally this is an argument among a group of middle-class politicians, you are not going to get any major policy shift on economic issues at Manguang. And you're not going to get it because, to put it quite, as I was in Nelson Mandela Metro the other day, and we had a session in New Brighton, and I made the obvious point. Shareholding people who sit on boards do not vote for left-wing policies. That's not a brilliant observation. And so it's not going to happen. So what you're going to happen is much the same as things have been, as has been happening for the last while or so. On the other hand, given the nature of the game as I described it, given that everybody is contesting, and given that everybody knows the demographics of the country and everybody knows the social and economic profile of the country, people are going to be busting a gut to show that they actually are moving left even when they aren't. And none of this should be rocket science, because if you want to get an illustration of what I'm talking about, have a look once again at the famous second transition document, which is still on the table, except that it's now called the second phase of the transition document. And there's something very interesting about that document which illustrates the point I'm trying to make. The first half has nothing to do with the second half. What do I mean when I say that? If you read the first half, you will say we need radical shifts, we need the poverty and inequality is a major crisis in this country, we need to deal with it, etc. Have a look at the second half and have a look at their policy proposals. The only policy proposal they made which would change anything dramatically was a line which somebody misinterpreted to mean that the Reserve Bank should be independent. Shouldn't be independent. And then somebody stood up and said, oh, well, the ANC says the Reserve Bank shouldn't be independent. And within kind of like 4 hours, Jeff Khadebe and Pravin Gordhan and anybody else was saying, no, we don't mean that. Of course the Reserve Bank should be independent. So, basically, why, you have to ask yourself, why does the governing party put out a document which gives all sorts of business people a fright, which means that some of us have to spend half of our year kind of trying to calm business people, which is not an easy thing to do because you're dealing with some very excitable people. You journalists may not read all the policy documents they read none of the policy documents, so you have to really start from scratch. But then you have no actual proposals to change anything, and that is because of the reality which I've been trying to describe. Incidentally, even if they could get over that reality, and that's something very important to remember about Manguang, even if they could get over that reality, there is no democracy I've ever seen on the face of this planet where the resolutions of the ruling party simply became government policy. Because governments don't just govern on behalf of the ruling party, they govern on behalf of the whole country. And what you have to do, if these proposals are made, if they ever get anywhere, is that you have to actually go and negotiate them with stakeholders, and you actually have a whole bargaining process, and they never merge anything like the form that they were passed in at the party conference. But I'm saying that I don't even expect any major shifts at the party conference, but I expect people to insist that there are shifts. And they will succeed, and that is why everything will get confusing, and the reason they will succeed is because people don't read the documents and they don't read the previous documents. And I'm simply going to illustrate this by demonstrating one thing which I'm convinced is going to happen at Manguang, and is going to confuse everybody. The ANC, I expect, will adopt as a principle at Manguang selective nationalization. Okay? And you can imagine how much excitement that would cause, right? What is selective nationalization? Selective nationalization is the phrase which was used in 1992 to describe ANC policy on nationalization and privatization. Why did the ANC need to do this in 1992? Well, if you really want to know that history, some of us can go back to 1990, let alone to 2007. We will know that when Madiba was released from prison, he went to the Grand Parade in Cape Town and he said nationalization is the policy of the African National Congress. So it was in the Freedom Charter. No, he said it on the Grand Parade and then the next day at Soweto. Okay, first said it at the Grand Parade. I can still see him standing. Okay. Over the next 2 years, there was a process in which he went all over the place, and Trevor Manuel got involved, and Tito Mboweni got involved, and they decided by about 1992 that perhaps nationalization wasn't such a good idea. But politics doesn't work like that, folks. You don't get up at a conference and say, you remember that thing we passed at Kliptown in 56? It was wrong. We're not going to do that stuff anymore. You don't do that, okay? You say, of course, what we passed at Kliptown was right, but we need to clarify it, comrades. There were some nuances there which we didn't deal with, okay? And the nuances which were not dealt with at Kliptown was that you nationalize, and that's what the selective nationalization decision said, you nationalize when the evidence suggests, and you privatize when the evidence suggests. Because, that's what it said, what wasn't explained at Kliptown, because remember, people went wrong at Kliptown, what wasn't explained at Kliptown was that nationalization is not a principle, it's a tactic. Okay. Now, that is going to be reiterated at Manguang. Okay. Why is it going to be reiterated at Manguang? Because politics don't change very much in this country. We are a country with deep inequalities. We are a country with acute racial inequalities. And the idea that a whole lot of things need to change is very deeply ingrained in this country for very obvious reasons. So in 2012, as well as in 1992, politicians do not get up and say, you guys who are talking about nationalization are really a bunch of misguided socialists who don't understand that free markets are good for everybody. You don't say that stuff because it doesn't get you re-elected. Okay. What you do is you say the same thing as you said in 1992. You say, comrades, it's all about selective nationalization. But if the composition of the ANC doesn't change, and I don't expect it to change, the fact that they haven't found any reason to they haven't found any evidence to nationalise in 20 years means that if this resolution is passed, the ANC remains the same. They won't find any reason to do it in the next 20 years. So really, this is a way of saying the selective nationalisation example is a very good example of how a policy resolution, which is saying we're not changing anything, is going to be interpreted as saying we're living in an entirely new environment and everything has changed, etc. And that is one example. The only way I can appeal to you as journalists to not fall prey to this kind of thing with other examples is to say the obvious. Read the document, spend a bit of time with Google, and go back and have a look at the previous documents, because we get into this stuff all the time, okay? They'll probably pass a resolution scrapping willing buyer, willing seller. Why do I say that? Because they've been doing it for 10 years. They always pass a resolution scrapping willing seller and willing buyer. The only thing I have a difficulty understanding is why it's newsworthy anymore, because if you do something every year for 10 years, it doesn't strike me as particularly newsworthy. And my obvious point is, how does one understand that they've been doing this? One goes and one looks at the document. So that's what I think is going to happen with the policy stuff. I think that there's going to be a lot of smoke and mirrors. I think that the outcome is going to be to remain more or less the same, and I think that the reason that is so is because of the structure of the ANC, and I'm confident that once things remain the same, people will devote a lot of energy to trying to convince you folks that things have changed. And because you folks have a responsibility to inform your viewers and listeners accurately, I'm appealing to you to read the documents and make sure that you don't fall prey to that. That doesn't mean that the resolutions that are going to be introduced at Manguang are irrelevant. But it means that I think that if we really want to look at where things might go and at what the ANC ought to be looking at, those aren't the resolutions we ought to be looking at. I'm not saying you shouldn't report on those resolutions. I'm simply saying that you should report accurately on those resolutions, and if you report accurately, you're probably going to find that they aren't all that exciting. If you've been following the argument so far, we're dealing with an organization which, because of its composition, is not torn apart by major policy differences, but it is torn apart by, to put it very bluntly, a major organizational crisis. Okay, this is an organization in crisis. And it's an organization in crisis because it hasn't adapted to these phenomena I've been talking about. It hasn't adapted to a situation in which people have moved. You move in 3 months from an organization in which these things are sorted out in negotiations between the leadership in back rooms, and suddenly you're in a situation where everybody's contesting and people are disputing the outcome. That is a major shock to the organization, and it's not a shock which the organization has been able to deal with yet. And therefore, the really interesting resolutions at Manguang are the resolutions which deal with that. And there are a variety of these resolutions which are out there, and the most important one for me is that there are resolutions which are going to deal with the relationship between money and politics. Because I've said before, and I remain convinced, and reading between the lines, I think that a lot of those ANC documents are trying to say the same thing. The biggest problem we have in this country, the biggest threat to democracy in this country, is the relationship between money and politics, in all sorts of ways. And I can talk about that in great detail. It's politicians buying favors from, it's business people buying favors from politicians, but politicians competing with each other to get posts so that they can be the person that the business person buys. There are all sorts of those things going on. And there is an initial attempt, and this has come up, to say, well, at least there should be legislation forcing disclosure. And that would be a very important first step. And that means that you have to actually say where you got your money from. The party has to say where it got its money from, and hopefully the office bearers have to say where they got their money from. You may remember a few years ago, if you follow these debates, I remember being in this building in a debate with Vivi and Floyd Shivambu on the whole question of lifestyle audits, which were a part of precisely this issue. The idea that at least citizens should know, and indeed the rank and file delegates of the ANC should know where people get their resources from, obviously so that you know whether people are being bought or not. So that is going to be on the table. The whole question of integrity commissions is going to be on the table. The question of cooling off periods, the question of do you allow people to go into businesses when they've left politics? Deployment has sort of come up in the past. It's been dealt with in legislation to a certain extent. It may come up again. Obviously, we have to be realistic about this. I'm not suggesting that if the ANC passes a few resolutions saying there ought to be disclosure, saying that they ought to get tougher on corruption, that they ought to make the controls work better, that suddenly the ANC is going to solve its crisis. Because the obvious point is that if you're dealing with some quite deep-rooted behavior by people who have very strong vested interests involved, there is always the danger that they will smile and pass the resolution and then go and do what the resolution says they're not allowed to do anyway. But initially, it will give us some sense of how the ANC is dealing with this very serious crisis. And really, perhaps, I'm not sure it's going to come up, but, if it doesn't come up, that's an indication. One of the things I think the resolutions will need to do and need to look at quite seriously is, the first step, it's going to be very difficult for the ANC to deal with this crisis, but the absolute first step which it will have to take is to end the denial. Okay, the ANC is in denial. The leadership of the ANC is in denial, and the denial has to stop. And I sound like I'm contradictory because I once say, this is an organisation which puts all its problems on the table, and then I say it's in denial. Well, human beings are complicated people, or beings, or whatever we are, and people are very often conflicted. On the one hand, the ANC is aware of all these problems. On the other hand, the ANC has not yet adjusted to a very simple reality. And the very simple reality is that the rules and the values that you have in place when people are fighting against apartheid and can go to jail for belonging to the organization are different to the rules you put in place where people get goodies when they get positions in the organization. And the absolute first thing you have to do is that you have to allow open contests. Because if you don't allow open contests, you don't get rid of the contest, you simply get rid of the openness, and we have what we've been seeing in the last 6 months. Okay, because what we've been seeing in the last 6 months, and journalists have been very much a part of it, is a frantic contest within the ANC, but it doesn't get resolved as it should be get resolved by people going out to the branches and saying, hi, I'm so-and-so and I want to be your president and this is why. It gets resolved by leaks and by misinformation and by claiming that Cyril is a mass murderer one day and that the other one is into teenagers on the other day. It's very nasty politics, and it's a result of the fact that we don't have people out there doing what they should be doing, which is saying, this is why I want to be your leader. Every time, and to talk about somebody I've dealt with over the years, to personalize it for a moment, every time Gwede Mantashe gets up and says, we need to get back to the old days of unity where we didn't contest, I'm tempted to actually go and grab the guy by the lapels and say, it's not 1985 anymore. We can't do this stuff anymore. Okay, it's now 2012. That genie's out of the bottle. People are going to contest. Now, perhaps Manguang, I live in hope, can have a discussion about how they contest so that the rules are fair, so that everybody tries to make sure that you don't buy votes, you win votes. You can't, to talk about a young man who appeared in court in Limpopo this morning, it's not okay to get the police to drive your opponents out of the hall when they're voting for the other guy. It's not okay to ignore court injunctions which say you can't actually molest people, etc. If that is not done in Manguang, then the crisis will continue for another 5 years. If it is grasped in Manguang, then it's not going to be easy for the reasons I've given. You don't simply make a magic wand to make this happen. But if these issues are grasped in Manguang, then you might see a significant shift. So to me, I will watch the economic resolutions with interest because they mean that my life's going to be made a misery by business people for 6 months. But I will watch the other resolutions about the ANC, about the ANC's organisational issues, because I think those are going to tell us, quite frankly, whether we are going to be dealing for the next 5 years with a governing party in an ever-growing crisis, or with a governing party which is actually trying to shift and trying to adjust to new realities. Given what's going on, is the party strong enough to withstand Manguang? I'm not sure that that's cut and dried. And therefore, I think, I'm absolutely convinced, and we've heard something about this at the moment, I think the pressure behind the scenes at the moment to actually work out a deal so that there's no election at Manguang is intense. Okay? And it's intense for a very good reason, because do you want to get to Manguang, which is certainly a possibility? I mean, at the moment, as of this morning, you have Northwest meeting in two different places. Okay, you have Oa Tambo district saying, no, this delegate's not okay, in the Eastern Cape, that delegate's not okay. Do you want that at Manguang? Because it could happen at Manguang, it's a very strong possibility. If you have it at Manguang, anything can happen. You can have the thing can be delayed for 2 or 3 days. You can have a situation which happened in Oa Tambo a while ago, where you have to say, well, comrades, we have to come back next year. So there are very, I'm not convinced that the ANC is in great shape to have a contested election at the moment, and I think that alone may compel people to do it. Your very interesting question of does this continue for another 5 years? It could continue for another 5 years, and I'll tell you why. Because if my analysis of the factions is correct, and we emerge in a situation in which those factions are still there and the president is not a member of either faction, then you are in that situation where people say, well, why should I leave this organization? It's the governing party, my group might win. And as long as that's the case, you can continue. And the consequences of continuing are not very pleasant. But you can continue. So.
What are the likely scenarios for the ANC following on from the election in 2014? Will there be like dropping their support, or is that just nonsense and they'll just carry on dominating?
Well, I think 2014 is too early for what I think is going to happen. If they mess up, if the ANC is still, if there's no post-Manguang split, which I don't expect, but I mean, if the whole thing goes off the rails, it could be a post-Manguang split. If there's no post-Manguang split, I think that the ANC vote will decline, but I don't think you're looking at anything dramatic. I think there's a lot of hype at the moment about the opposition, and those people who are hyping up the opposition really ought to do what some people in my profession did a while ago, which is actually to just analyze the numbers. Okay. And the numbers show that you've got 2.5... What happened in the last local elections, which were very misleading, because the DA picked up a lot of support from other opposition parties, which was then presented as support from the ANC. It's pretty much accepted that they took away 2.5% support from the ANC. So let us say that they really, which I don't expect, let's say that they really excel themselves and take away 7.5% from the ANC. You've still got the ANC pretty close to 60%, and you've still got the DA at about 24%. So, it's not going to make a massive difference. What I think the ANC has to be concerned about in relation to Manguang and in relation to Manguang going on is that is another split. Because if there is another split in the ANC, it obviously changes our politics quite substantially. At the moment, you've got about 65% of the voting population who are broadly ANC people, and there's only one party that they vote for, or they either vote for that party or they stay at home. If there are two of those parties, then your politics changes dramatically, but I don't think that's going to happen this time around. And if it doesn't happen this time around, yes, I would expect the ANC vote to drop, but I don't think dramatically.